Hello.
Our story begins in the era of the New Republic. The war was over, but there was still much work to be done. With the Chancellor and the Senate rallying around their own positions on the new military bills proposed by the Defense Council, Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker was returning from the fall. During the Galactic Civil War, he met Hera Syndulla, and she was amazed by how much Luke reminded her of two people she loved and lost. Kanan and Ezra were both similar to one another, and yes, Luke's special gifts made him the familiar type for her to be around. Within the conversation, Luke promised her that he would visit Lothal when the war came to an end, so that he may pay respects to, at the very least, Kanan. There was still hope that Ezra was still somewhere out in the galaxy, but no one knew because it had almost been a full 10 years since he departed with the Purgle. Skywalker met up with his sister inside of her senatorial apartment on Coruscant. Leia was stressed out of her mind, because she had to prove to people why they needed a defense council and a defense fleet or military. It was mind-boggling. While they didn't know in the moment, they were sitting on a balcony facing their mother's former apartment, and therefore the Jedi Temple, just beyond some other skyscrapers. In this brief interaction, Leia sighed heavily and looked to the sky. The stars were pretty much invisible past the light pollution that overcrowded Coruscant's entire ecumenopolis. She told her brother that she missed her father. Luke understood that Leia would never consider Vader or Anakin to be her father, so he knew when she said this that she was referring to Bail Organa. Luke sympathized with her, even though he couldn't fully relate. He was never super jarred by the death of Owen and Beru, and Vader was a year-long search for redemption. Luke knew that their birthday was coming up soon, and he tried to think of a way to bring her to a certain peace. Leia admitted that she never got to say goodbye, not to Bail, nor Brea, nor the planet she called home for 19 years of life. It was a devastating loss. She had only her imagination to plague her with what her parents' final moments of life were like, because she knew by this point that the Empire informed people that they needn't be worried. That was a true travesty in her eyes. Regardless, she stiffened her voice and told Luke that the defense bill would withhold the Remnant from making any moves. If they passed it, they could finally extinguish the Empire and begin rebuilding without worrying about a true threat. They had the rest of their food before Luke went on his own way to begin a new mission: how to give Leia a piece of home. There were Alderaan survivors around the galaxy, and that was a problem all of them faced. Losing their home world wasn't just losing a place to live, but entire families, friends' families, cultures, and religions. It was a deep, cutting wound that left a mark on everyone's heart, and would last for generations. Skywalker knew that no one was bringing pieces of dirt from Alderaan with them on vacations, because they never expected the Empire to have the ability to destroy it, or even have the intention of destroying a core world. Luke, though, had a great idea, one that he intended to investigate further. While on Lothal, he took a gander at a hole left behind by Palpatine. A mural of the Ones and a portal to the world between worlds lived on the planet. While it wasn't there anymore and was destroyed inside the Chimera by Bridger, Skywalker knew of another location where a portal existed. Inside the old Jedi Temple of Coruscant, Palpatine planted relics to use whenever he wanted. Despite never getting inside the world between worlds himself, he had it placed inside of their training halls. In his mind, it was the ultimate disrespect, because the buried Jedi under the temple had to roll in their graves knowing that the Sith Lord was playing with their knowledge inside their hallowed halls. Well, the Force sometimes has to intervene, because darkness is not allowed to enter the portal. Anyways though, that's where Luke went, and without much struggle he was able to read through some Jedi journals and open the portal himself, as Ezra had all those years before. When Luke entered, he was taken aback by the remarkable gift of the Force. It truly was an incredible location, and he took it all in before beginning his investigation. Luke was hoping to find Alderaan and give Leia a piece of her own memories to her in person. Within the span of an hour, Luke with his journal was able to find a portal to Alderaan. It was actually when Obi-Wan returned Leia's droid Lola to her. It was a cute reunion during the Age of Empire, and it brought a smile to Luke's face. As he read in the journal, he lifted his black glove and twisted it gently. The portal moved and rotated into the future. Luke simply wanted to make sure he could control it and return Leia to some happy memories of her life on Alderaan, and he had found the key to doing it. but as he tried to turn it, he realized how sensitive the Force was to his movements. So as he tried to reset it back to the moment he came to, he twisted a little too hard, and years flashed by him. Luke gripped the portal, dropping the book and using both of his hands to try and manipulate its movement. But before he could see the time period, he was sucked in and lost to an unknown time, forever changing the galaxy he had just left. What he didn't know is that Leia had followed him, fearing that she had worried or even upset her brother. Luke fell onto the ground and searched the skies. He saw modern-looking skyscrapers with dozens of people joyfully walking around. Alderaan looked beautiful as ever, and then came the fighters. Well, it turns out sometimes history repeats itself. Maybe a little too much. The Empire of the current era was taking the fight to the core, and Alderaan was in the way. Fire fell from the skies, and explosions sent people and buildings in the different directions. Skywalker readied a saber and deflected a shot back into a fighter, sending it barreling towards a building and detonating. He, in that moment, realized that he had accidentally, just forever, altered the past. Skywalker quickly looked for the book he was holding within the World Between Worlds, but it was gone. He must have dropped it, and now, he had no time to look for it. People were scurrying around in panic, as Sith marauders descended from the skies to defeat this Jedi warrior. But something was off. Jedi don't wear black robes, and Jedi usually wore armor to protect their bodies. Skywalker wasn't quite the elegant fighter of the same Jedi from this time, but he was still beyond talented. His saber slashed up to defend a strike, and he was thrown back by another marauder. These vicious Sith were here to take him down, and he knew this wouldn't be like fighting a Vader that didn't want to entirely kill his son. He rolled out of the way, ripping a piece of debris across the ground from where he came from, as it ripped through the marauder's legs. Luke raised his weapon, parrying the next attacker and spinning around him, thrusting his saber behind his back and connecting with their ribs, before pulling out and sidestepping another attack and defending himself. He used the Force to break the ground under the individual he was defending himself from. When they fell, he sliced through them. Skywalker whipped back, bashing down on the wounded villain, and then swinging aggressively a few more times and breaking the defense and killing them. He may have not been as physically imposing as his father, but he was still his father's son. Luke continued to fend off attacking Sith troopers. The first 3 marauders were the only Sith he saw initially, as he led the people away from the coming attackers. He would cut through troopers and use tanks against the Sith, but none of this would give him the result he wanted. He may have been altering history, regrettably, but he did save the few lives that would have been lost, or I guess were already lost. Luke, as the people escaped the fires that burned through the city, turned to stop the Sith from following the dozens of survivors. His weapon collided with another marauder, and they didn't give him a chance to hold his own. He fell backwards and rolled across the dirt as a saber slammed down behind him. Luke threw his hand forward, and then he saw him, their leader, a pale-skinned creature, pointing heroically, as if he had been here the entire time. The yellow Sith eyes locked with Skywalker, and he remembered every encounter he had with the Sith, but mostly remembering being inside the throne room with Palpatine. The chill from that same room was sent down his back now, and he rushed to his feet. The creature called out something inaudible over the blasting inferno beyond them. Skywalker avoided a strike at his neck, and countered, jabbing and slashing through 2 more marauders before getting clocked in the back of the head with a blaster's butt. He fell over unconscious, and the Sith Lord told his troopers to carry him with them on their assault. He wished to understand more about this Jedi Protector. Not just any Jedi would be stationed on Alderaan. It was an unrecognized target for the Republic. No one would ever expect the Sith to hit it, and no Jedi should be stationed here, let alone one with black robes. At least, Malgus thought for the moment. When the light returned to Luke's eyes, he would be interrogated immediately. Malgus wanted to know who he was and why he was here. Skywalker, instead of responding immediately, tried to put together his historical knowledge and understand who he was seeing right in front of him. This was clearly a Sith Lord, and he was so curious that the words accidentally slipped out. Malgus was almost offended and nearly removed Luke's head in that moment. The sound of his lightsaber activating was proof that Malgus was no Sidious. He wasn't here to turn Luke into one of his pawns. This was a Jedi killer, someone who didn't want an apprentice, but someone who wanted to extinguish an entire religion out of hatred. Sidious was more methodical with his approaches. Malgus would be more brute. He raised his weapon against Luke's throat and asked why the High Council sent him to Alderaan. Luke tried to explain the predicament, explaining that he was a new era Jedi, hence the black robes. This confused Malgus more than it annoyed him, which luckily saved Luke's life. The black robes were an indication of some sort of difference, but at this point, Luke's information or tangent felt like a dance macabre. He was going to die anyways, and so Malgus, bored of the direction, raised his saber and prepared to slash down when an explosion sounded, launching Sith troopers from their feet. It was the Republic. Luke looked over, just as confused, and Malgus decided to finish the job here. As he moved to jab the weapon through Luke's chest, a detonator landed at his feet. Luke lobbed his head backwards and protected himself as best as he could. One of the Marauders pounced on the detonator to protect his master, which killed him in the process. The heavy vehicles that the Sith were utilizing started to crumble, and Jace Malcolm led his troopers on the assault. Their weapons pulverized through the Sith troopers. It was full-blown guerrilla warfare, and the Republic had the advantage. Luke was able to use this assault to free himself, pulling his saber into his hand and cutting the cuffs, before backstabbing the Marauder that was supposed to be looking over him. He, with the Force, launched an unsuspecting Malgus off of his feet. The Sith Lord was fending off attacks from the incoming Republic warriors. After breaking through 3 or 4 trees, he stopped, and Luke swung his lightsaber rapidly and defending blaster fire from hitting him. Sith troopers collapsed, and he used the Force to throw more off their feet, before Malgus, rising with anger, engaged him. Immediately, he understood what kind of opponent this was. He was basically fighting an unmasked Vader, which gave him a slight advantage. Luke played into defense early, allowing the other Republic troopers to fire into Sith lines. As the skirmish continued to intensify, with Skywalker and Malgus slamming their weapons into each other, holding up the middle of the line, they were aided by special forces. Another Jedi with a saber staff slammed into the ground, gutting 4 or 5 Marauders with both sides of her blades. Luke and Malgus continued trading blows. This was a Jedi who had lost her master to the Sith, standing across from her. She was confused in seeing Luke, because Jedi didn't typically wear black robes, but she didn't say anything. She just joined the fight, seeing that Luke was trying to kill a Sith. Malgus backpedaled away, striking Luke from him and protecting his sides from Satele Shan. She pressed harder and more aggressively than Luke, who patiently used his time against the Sith. As Satele made her assault, Skywalker punished a Marauder who attempted to surprise him. He then cut through another few who tried to stop Satele from killing their leader. But sadly, she wouldn't kill him, but she nor Luke would know that. With the Force, she launched the Sith Lord through the air and into a mountain, and continued piling wave after wave of power against him. When she let up, he was nowhere to be seen, completely covered by the mountain and gone from view. She found humor in that, but she turned to Luke, who was still helping Jace and the troopers fend off the Sith Horde, which was now entering a full-blown retreat. They would have their interaction and it would be confusing. Introductions shared, but interrupted by a battle status, before more interactions were shared and more understanding given. None of it made any sense to Satele, because being from a future like that didn't make a lot of sense, but she had to accept it as the truth, because what else would or could Luke say? That he was from their time but didn't know anything about it? Luke had a decent grasp on history, but he still had a lot of work to do in understanding it. Well, he was living it now, and for him, finally getting a year was both terrifying and at the very least relieving. Now, he knew where he was. Issue is, it was a whole 3,000 years before he was ever born. The current year was 3667 BBY, and Alderaan had just fallen, though Shan knew that they needed to return to Coruscant. Firstly, she was in need of direction from the High Council, and secondly, they needed to meet Luke. Before going any further, Luke didn't get to this point in his history lessons that he knew that Malgus survived, so they would leave. Of course, there'd be time to learn about the future, but for now, the Republic needed to figure out how it might conquer the new Sith Empire, and if there was even a hope in doing so, because this was a galactic-sized threat. If they could just sweep Alderaan, then they had to worry about Coruscant, or what would come next. Quickly, the Jedi would be on the next transport off-world and return to the Jedi Temple. Oddly enough, for Luke, the temple hadn't changed in 3,000 years, which was peculiar, but no biggie. It was an ancient temple for a reason. Luke walked into their chambers with Satele, and noticed another unchanged aspect about this order. He watched recordings from the Jedi Council of Yoda's time, stretching from the late Republic to the High Republic, and he noticed how eerily similar everything was. The Jedi were just seemingly waiting for collapse. But Luke had just won his war, and until he could figure out how to return home, he would win this one too. Surely he hadn't changed too much by being at Alderaan, but even this interaction was going too far. And without his book, he didn't even know how to access the world between worlds or where to find a portal. He knew about the one on Lothal, but that would take dozens of months or years of digging, with the threat of the Sith discovering it after he used it, something that he refused to allow. Luke, like his sister, missed his home now. He wished he could return to his family, but if he could sacrifice himself for their benefit, then he would do it without a problem. It's what he was prepared to do right here and right now. Skywalker spoke to the council, referencing everything he said to Master Shan, assuming that she was by this point a Jedi Master, and told them his thoughts. He did highlight that he had just won a war, and he intended on winning another. But something Luke didn't know about these councils is the bureaucracy that wore them down, and basically stripped them of their own power. Luke was in for a culture shock because that's what the current council started yapping about. They didn't have the resources to target the seemingly larger than ever Sith threat. Luke had a lot to learn, and despite him being the last Jedi, as he referred to himself as, the council wasn't willing to risk whatever happened to him into their own world. They respected his ability to stop the Sith in his own time, but this was a different war in their eyes. There were thousands of Sith. There was no rule of two or whatever it was, and they had to be vigilant in defending their territory, not worrying about the larger threat of bouncing around the Outer Rim. This actually frustrated Satele, because she believed that Luke was, in some respect, right. He wasn't entirely correct because there were some very large differences between this era and his, but he was right about taking the fight to the Sith Empire. If they were allowed to persist, then they would continue dividing Republic territory and creating ruptures that could split everything, or position themselves in a predicament of which they wouldn't survive. It was following this session with the High Council that Satele and Luke would go to the Jedi archives and sit at a table together and go through the history he knew to be true. It was a good point for both Jedi to understand the most about each other and their respective time periods. The Old Republic was no galactic civil war. These were full armies, troops, and fleets squaring off. This wasn't a rebellion. This was a galactic-level threat challenging another, and unlike the Clone War that Luke spoke of, no one was controlling both sides, at least as far as Satele knew. These weren't an intelligent Sith. They were brutes, warriors, and foolish often, but their foolhardiness also accompanied their vast power. It wasn't like they were an unprepared unit. They had the numbers to compete with the Republic, and that's when everything clicked for Skywalker. He addressed what she referred to these Sith as. If they were indeed brutes, then they should be treated as that type of threat. Outsmarting them, comparatively, wouldn't include mind games. It would include the precise strike of a dagger, accompanied by the perfect concentrated twist. Something that wouldn't work on a Sidious but might work on a Malgus. Together, Satele and Luke would begin to strategize where the dagger needed to go. Days of planning with Skywalker, Shan, and Malcolm had them coming to a realization. The Sith were diverting their attention. They had just proven to themselves that they could get into the core without competition. So if they were capable of doing that, then surely their next stop would be Coruscant. Well, not exactly. They had proof that they could get into the core. The Republic would move to defend itself, leaving outer edge territory unprotected, giving the Sith easy targets to hit. Based on Jace's intel, the Republic was doing as they believed they wouldn't. They were moving themselves back to the core to defend themselves. Now came the difficult part. The Sith, without leadership, would have their own quarrels, something they likely addressed following Malgus's presumed death on Alderaan. Going off the basis of Malgus being dead, the key was Luke cut in. Korriban. That was the key, right? If they wanted to leave a lasting mark, they'd go for the gut, even if the Sith aren't there. Leveling their temple would be the move to confuse them, keep them off guard. It made perfect sense. Strategically, the Sith would be breaking down Republic defenses on the outer edge of territory. The Republic would defend the core before splitting off to defend the rest of their dominion after losing too much. This would result in another core world being clobbered, potentially Coruscant. But if the Sith could be beat at their own game, then the Jedi could rupture the entire plan. Jace and Satele, respectively, would use their own contacts to prepare a counter force large enough to make this move. Neither were sure if someone would go for it, but it was suggested that Luke go and speak to the Chancellor, which he would, to see if they might get some approval. Surprisingly to all of them, the Chancellor liked it. If he lost a fleet, an army, or 2 Jedi, then he was willing to make the risk. Just players on the board that could be sacrificed for victory. If they won, then he looked like a genius. If they lost, then at least the Sith plan would be diverted for some time. The Republic gave the 2 Jedi a sizable fleet. Nothing massive and nothing that would take away from their forces present in the core. It was a miniature mobilization, something that also came accompanied by an assortment of other Jedi. Most of these Jedi were warriors, with a couple of healers to maintain their ranks. The High Council presided over the departure, believing that none of them would step foot on Coruscant again in their lives. Luke especially was high in spirits. He believed full-heartedly that this would be a successful operation, and this confidence extended to the others with them. This was a volunteer mission only, so the Jedi who came with had some sense of belief in at least Satele Shan. They knew her, they didn't know Luke. But throughout their trip in hyperspace, they would come to appreciate Skywalker, and see him as almost a visionary behind this move. Satele was just the root needed to get this thing moving. Luke had some ideas that could stretch into branches. When they dropped out of hyperspace, the fleet Satele once saw here had vanished. That was probably for the better, for them at least. A quick scan confirmed that they were free to pass through the debris field. Shan looked away as they passed the space station her master died within. But she couldn't help the racing thought of wondering if his dead body still sat inside the hangar bay where he surely died. A thought for another time perhaps. The fleet dropped its gunships and they sped towards the surface of the planet. Jedi, troopers, and hope was standing in the way of the true Sith triumph over the galaxy. When they landed, they were met with a very fragile resistance. Thanks to the fleet, the troopers on the surface weren't able to send a distress call to neighboring systems. But there was something else. As Luke and Satele led the Republic towards the temple, they were met with heavier forces. The Sith may have not presented their fleet, but this was due to Malgus' own ambitions. He believed that he could sweep the Republic, and when the time came for him to fully heal, he would join them. Since Alderaan, he was attempting a number of techniques to heal his injured body, which didn't work. He struggled to breathe, and while he used this for power, he also couldn't breathe, which is a bit problematic if you want to live. So by the time the Jedi arrived, he was finally outfitting himself with a mask that suited his personal requests and desires. When his guards retaliated to the incoming attack, Malgus fastened the mask on his face and attached all the tubes to necessary respirators. By the time the Jedi entered the temple, Malgus was ready to go. His saber ignited, and as Jedi and Sith collided, he singled out who he believed to be the weaker opponent. Skywalker was thrown backwards, slamming his blade into the ground to stop a strike at his legs. Malgus bodied him, overpowering his smaller frame and pushing him off his feet, but Luke landed, defending the strikes that rapidly pushed him away from the other Jedi and Sith. The other fights were a lot more even, with only Satele being the most dominant of the other warriors that came with Luke. Outside, Republic troopers led by Jace Malcolm set up a perimeter and used it to ferry bombs in and around the temple structure. Inside, where the action was taking place, Skywalker thrusted his blade at Malgus, but slipped away when the Sith Lord crushed through a pillar. Their weapons slammed in the middle, with Malgus towering over Luke and shoving his weapon down almost into his chest. Skywalker backed away, spinning his saber in a circle with his hands and powering forward. The Sith Lord, despite all of his overpowering gifts, was pushed backwards into another pillar, before spinning around and slicing through a coffin for one of the fallen Sith in history. Luke jumped over the broken relic, and used the Force to disperse bones and cloaks and dust all over his opponent. He then eyed the other Jedi, watching Satele wipe through acolytes, with the other Jedi doing similar feats with the assortment of Sith engaging them. Skywalker sidestepped Malgus, and threw his hand up to block his strike with the Force. The Sith Lord shoved down harder and harder, but with no avail. He watched his own saber get flung up over his head. Physical strength was no match compared to the Force, and Luke, despite not knowing it, was rewarded within these hallowed Sith halls. His bloodline craved darkness, and fed off of its power. He used it here, and he slashed at Malgus. The Sith grabbed his wrist and tried to snap it, but that was Luke's metallic hand. Skywalker kicked him in the abdomen and he stumbled back, before pulling the saber of another Sith and igniting it and slashing down. When Satele looked up, she saw a second lightsaber ignite, and what looked to be Luke lose his head. but it was just a misconception. He tilted his head back so far, he could basically see upside down. It was an awkward position to hold while interlocked, but it did the job. Luke came back up and dragged his saber down, and removed one of Malgus' arms. The two stood apart from each other, and Skywalker readied his weapon, seizing his breath and patiently waiting out his opponent. Behind and beyond their engagement, the Jedi were finally winning, and Republic troopers were faring into the temple to finish their demolition. Foolish Malgus never anticipated the Jedi counter, and right here he would pay for having been so ignorant. Luke batted down on Malgus' saber, and he parried, using his dominant physical strength to stop the Jedi's pursuit. Luke, utilizing what could best be described as the dark side, crushed the pillar next to Malgus, forcing him to use his last hand to defend himself, raising the pillar above his head so that it didn't crush him. Luke, as a result, drove his weapon through Malgus' chest. A shocked expression sat on his face until he collapsed, and the pillar slammed down on top of him. Luke heaved and backed away. The sound of clashing sabers behind him slowly became inaudible as the Jedi seized final victory on Korriban. Satele and a healer came to his side to ask if he was alright, and Luke nodded his head. In that moment, he felt it all. He had just reenacted his fight with Vader, this time more skilled, balanced, and understanding of his own abilities. But what frightened him the most was his ability to take Malgus' life. But this again wasn't the same as fighting Vader. There was no good to save within the creature he had just killed. Malgus was just another useless cog in the Sith Order that was destined to find destruction 3,000 years from now. Luke was brought from the temple, where his head would clear, and with their evacuation it would be brought down, destroying thousands of years of Sith history in one blow. The Jedi had done it. The war was far from over, but instead of protecting the ancient Sith world like they had before they returned, the Jedi showed the Sith that they were not welcome back. They were going to become extinct, and Skywalker planned on seeing that come to fruition. Skywalker and Shan would report back to the Chancellor, who would commission the two of them as the first official Jedi generals of the Republic military. Their victory, while small in size, blindsided the Sith, and now with their leadership positions, they pioneered larger Republic forces. As Luke came to see the older he got, he realized how similar he and his father were. They both thrived in the arena of combat, and Luke almost came to enjoy this aspect of his life as an Old Republic Jedi Knight. He was a true warrior. Unlike his time with the Rebellion, he helped create full-blown assaults and counterattacks. The loss of Malgus put the Sith into a tailspin, with many of their most powerful warriors vying for power. This didn't result in the imminent destruction of the Sith. One lineage was ruptured, but others still remained. Skywalker, determined to stop someone like Palpatine from rising in the future, pushed the Republic to become almost villainous. They weren't being aggressive to civilians, but their assaults were punishing. The Sith lost more than perhaps they ever had prior to Luke's arrival. They were unable to stop the relentless assault pushed by General Skywalker and General Shan. While a slight love triangle would form between Luke, Shan, and Jace, Skywalker believed it unnecessary to risk their odds of success to pursue such endeavors. His sister was still on his mind, and he missed Leia. But Luke would be remiss if he ever allowed another Sith to walk on this plane, in this galaxy, or in this cosmos again. This was not vengeance, nor found in darkness, but a concrete decision to eradicate a threat that promised to enslave the galaxy. Skywalker had seen it, and thanks to his successes, he was taken more seriously by the High Council, the Chancellor, and other top Republic officers. He warned of a future that would undo all of their hard work. The Sith of the now would return in a future 3,000 years in the making. They would find their own method of preservation to wage war on the galaxy from within. The fear of this, which is exactly what Luke wanted to instill in these people of this era, pushed both factions, Republic and Jedi, to become hyper-aware of Sith movements. The Jedi maintained their honor and their code, but they refused to let Sith live. Every action by the Jedi made as an act of war was reciprocated with 3 more acts of kindness to people around the galaxy. The Jedi tried to balance themselves out, as Luke, having walked between light and dark, confronted the Sith on front lines of battle across the galaxy. 10 years after the fall of Alderaan, in 3657 BBY, the galaxy was in a different state. The Sith were cowering, the Jedi were hunting. and every relic of the Sith religion was actively being found and destroyed. There was a complete and absolute refusal to allow them to remain in power. No more space stations over home worlds, no more defending their honor. This was the end of them. In the end, Luke, after spending 10 years of his life destroying the Sith, decided to remain here, in this galaxy. Being that he was pushing his 40s, he believed that the destruction of the Sith would stop the Jedi from falling in the future, which meant that, hopefully, the Order would never crumble from within. Skywalker would maintain a peaceful operation of the Outer Rim, which included stopping some later criminal organizations from ever finding their grounding. This was the period where people experienced tragedy, watched terror, and then promised themselves that it would never happen again. But the Republic, the Jedi, and the galaxy were all sentients, fickle beings that make simple mistakes, ones that erode into even larger, more heinous reminders of what they really are. A small mistake, or any small mistake though, Luke hoped would never see the rise of the Sith again. He wouldn't know it because of the vast size of the Sith military, but Skywalker would kill the last of the Sith, an elder warrior who survived all of his allies, and never was betrayed by his students. This individual hunted Luke, instead of cowering in fear. As Skywalker was informed when he first arrived, these were brute Sith, and this elder warrior didn't have the wherewithal to know that he was the last of his kind. Their religion would die, and Luke would hold a secret relationship with a local in the Outer Rim, this giving him an extra layer of happiness that gave him even more reason to remain in the old era. What he would come to learn through the world between worlds at another location, one that would be destroyed after he used it, would be the future he saw. His birthday gift was given to Leia. She would return from the world between worlds after having followed her brother in, and finding his book without finding him. When she exited, her galaxy was shifted. No longer was Coruscant rebuilding. It was a prosperous society, one established in 3,000 years of, give or take, mostly peace. The pain committed by fickle beings was done generations before she was ever born. Her father and mother were still alive, but so were her biological parents. Anakin and Padme would still meet, as fate had intended for them. And instead of being twins, the great descendant of Republic Jedi General Luke Skywalker would have a singular daughter. It was a weird adjustment for Leia, one that reshaped her life, but she had grown up in a family close to the Organas, ones that included yearly outings to Alderaan, one that still stood. And on the planet, in a capital city, was a location where she could still find her brother. A memorial for a long-gone but never forgotten hero of the Old Republic. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Giveaway down below. Go check it out. 2 Venators. That's a pretty cool thing, I think. Go check it out. Anyways, let's talk about this story. So, a little bit of a conundrum here. I was really split up to the end on this story. I'm sure you can tell. But I wasn't sure where I wanted Luke to go. I thought about bringing him back, but I really like the idea of Luke being the establishment of the Skywalker lineage. I know there was like kind of an easy shot there with pairing him up with Revan's descendant, but I don't know, it just didn't feel right. I don't know why, it didn't feel right in the story. I felt like it'd come off forced, and I didn't want that. As for like Luke as a general, I kind of like the idea of him just being a Jedi general in the Old Republic. I don't know, I think he would thrive there. I think you would see this just overpowered being, someone that's pretty much unstoppable. And I kind of think the idea of Anakin growing up in this family where they have this legendary icon to look up to. I foresee a galaxy that's very, very united in this galaxy that Leia comes back to, and that Anakin is brought to the Jedi Temple as a child, and that's how he ends up meeting Padme. It's kind of like a play on fate. Rather than the Sith accidentally creating him, is that Luke created this bloodline that it was possible for him to become born because of, like, I don't know, genetics passed down from 3,000 years of, I don't know, yeah, something. More or less, it was really fun to put Luke into this era and have him fighting someone like Malgus. I always have a lot of fun with Malgus, and putting him in a situation where he's fighting Luke was really kind of fun. I wanted to distinguish the difference between Sidious era calculation versus, like, the brute era of Sith forces in the Old Republic. It's not saying that they're not smart. I'm saying that they're more brutal in their tactics. They're more brutes rather than being cold and calculated and trying to have the perfect answer. I think Luke would be able to thrive off of that by playing back at that aggressiveness, because the Sith he knew were polar opposites. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, that the Force be with you.